In the summer of 1929, a shoeshine boy on Wall Street gave a stockbroker a hot tip on which stocks to buy. The broker went home that night and couldn't sleep, not because of excitement, but because he realized, if the shoeshine boy is buying stocks, the market is finished. Welcome to the capital architecture. Today, we're putting the blueprint of the greatest financial collapse in modern history on the table, the 1929 crash. Not just what happened, but why it was mathematically inevitable. To understand the crash, you first need to understand the high, because the 1920s weren't just good, they were dangerously good. World War I had left Europe in ruins, but America came out of it as the world's manufacturing engine. Cars, radios, refrigerators. Consumer goods were flooding the market for the first time in history. Companies were printing profits, and their stock prices reflected that. Between 1920 and 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose nearly 500%. To put that in perspective, if you had invested $10,000 in 1920, you'd be sitting on almost $60,000 by 1929. People weren't just watching this from the sidelines, they wanted in. And this is where the system started building its own trap. Banks and brokers introduced something called buying on margin. The concept was simple and seductive. You didn't need the full price of a stock to buy it. You could put down 10%, borrow the rest from your broker, and ride the gains. If a stock rose 20%, you didn't make 20%. You made 200% on your original investment. Leverage amplified everything on the way up. But leverage is a weapon with no handle. It cuts both ways. By 1929, an estimated 1 in 3 Americans was somehow exposed to the stock market, directly or through the banks holding their savings. Ordinary people. Teachers, factory workers, farmers. Everyone believed the market only went one direction. There was even a phrase for it. Economists and politicians called it the New Era, a period of permanent prosperity. John J. Raskob, a senior executive at General Motors, published an article in August 1929 titled "Everybody Ought to Be Rich." His argument was that investing just $15 a month in stocks would make any working American wealthy within 20 years. The article came out 2 months before the crash. The first cracks appeared in September. Stock prices started drifting. Nothing catastrophic, just a subtle loss of momentum. But markets run on confidence, and confidence, once it starts to crack, doesn't stop. On October 24th, 1929, a day history remembers as Black Thursday, panic arrived. Sell orders flooded the exchanges. Prices collapsed so fast that the ticker tape machines couldn't keep up. Investors watching the tape had no idea what their stocks were actually worth in real time. They only knew the number was falling. A group of major bankers pooled resources that afternoon and bought large blocks of stock publicly. A calculated show of confidence designed to stop the bleeding. It worked, temporarily. 5 days later, on October 29th, Black Tuesday, the dam broke entirely. 16 million shares traded in a single day. A record that would stand for decades. There were no buyers, only sellers. Margin calls went out across the country, brokers demanding immediate cash from investors who had bought on credit. Those who couldn't pay were liquidated instantly. Stocks that had been worth fortunes were suddenly worth less than the paper they were printed on. In a matter of weeks, $40 billion in market value had evaporated. That's equivalent to over $700 billion today. But here is what most people miss about 1929. The crash itself didn't cause the Great Depression. What turned a market collapse into a decade of human suffering was what came after. Banks had speculated heavily in the market themselves. When stocks collapsed, hundreds of banks became insolvent overnight. Depositors, ordinary people, ran to withdraw their savings. Banks that were still technically solvent collapsed simply because they couldn't meet the sudden demand for cash. By 1933, over 9,000 American banks had failed. The government's response made it worse. The Federal Reserve, instead of injecting liquidity into a dying system, raised interest rates. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, triggering retaliatory trade barriers from Europe and choking international commerce. Unemployment hit 25%. Industrial output fell by nearly half. The shoeshine boy's tip was never really about stocks. It was a signal that every layer of society, people with no financial sophistication, no risk management, no margin for error, had been pulled into a speculative machine none of them fully understood. When that machine reversed, it didn't just punish the gamblers, it destroyed the savings of the careful, the jobs of the hardworking, and the lives of people who had never bought a single share. The 1929 crash didn't happen because of one bad day. It happened because a decade of easy credit, unchecked leverage, and collective delusion built a structure that looked like prosperity, but had no foundation underneath it. The architectural blueprint was flawed from the start, and in markets, flawed structures don't bend, they collapse. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think a crash like 1929 could happen again today, or has the system learned its lesson? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to suggest which financial crisis, institution, or empire we should examine next, drop it in the comments. The next case study might be yours. If you found this analysis useful, don't forget to subscribe to The Capital Architecture. See you in the next one.